welcome. Tonight, you can relax completely. Let the tensions of your day dissolve as you settle into a softer place, a quieter time. There is nothing you need to do but listen, and even that requires no effort at all. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift. You are safe here, in the comfort of the present. We are going to journey together into the past, into a world very different from your own. A world where death walked beside life, with an intimacy we can scarcely imagine today. We will step into the shadowed streets of medieval Europe, into the era of the Black Death, that great pestilence that swept across the continent in waves, claiming millions of lives, reshaping society, altering the very rhythm of existence. Tonight, you will inhabit the role of a plague doctor, that iconic and terrifying figure in the beaked mask, moving through plague-stricken towns. You will witness the desperation of those final years of feudalism, the peasants who rose in revolt, the religious extremists who believed suffering could purchase salvation, and the wealthy who fled to their country estates while the world burned with fever. This is history told slowly, carefully, with all the small details that make the past feel real. There is no rush here. Time moves differently in these old streets. Let yourself sink into the rhythm of their lives, however grim, however distant. And if you drift away before the story ends, that is exactly as it should be. Let us begin in the 14th century, in a town gripped by plague, where you have just donned your leather coat and beaked mask, preparing to make your rounds through neighborhoods thick with the scent of death. Imagine yourself standing in a small room, perhaps a rented chamber near the center of a European town. The year might be 1348, or 1630, or any year between when plague swept through cities with devastating regularity. Outside your window, the street is quieter than it should be. The usual sounds of commerce and conversation are muted, replaced by an occasional distant cry, the rumble of a cart, the tolling of church bells marking another death. You are a plague doctor. You have been hired by the town council, contracted specifically to tend to those afflicted with pestilence. The pay is extraordinary, far more than most physicians could ever hope to earn, because the work is so dangerous that few are willing to accept it. Some plague doctors are experienced physicians. Others are merely apothecaries, barbers, or even men with no medical training at all, simply willing to take the risk for the reward. But all of you share one thing: the knowledge that each day might be your last. Before you leave this room, you must don your costume. It lies draped over a wooden chair, an assemblage of protective garments that have become the symbol of plague itself. You begin with the long overcoat, an ankle-length robe made of heavy waxed leather or canvas, treated with suet or wax so that it forms a barrier. The theory, as explained by the town's authorities and your fellow doctors, is that the wax will prevent the corrupted air, the miasma, from penetrating the fabric and reaching your skin. The wax also prevents fleas from burrowing into the cloth, though you may not fully understand the significance of this protection. The coat is stiff and heavy. It weighs upon your shoulders as you fasten it closed. The leather creaks as you move. Already, you feel the first stirrings of discomfort, the way the garment will cause you to sweat in the summer heat, the way it will chafe after hours of wearing it. Next come the gloves, also made of leather, extending well past your wrists to ensure no gap exists between sleeve and hand. Your fingers feel clumsy in the thick material. You will not be able to touch your patients with any sensitivity or gentleness. Every examination will be conducted at a distance, through barriers. Then comes the mask. This is the element that will make you an object of terror to the townspeople. You lift it carefully. It is fashioned from leather, shaped to cover your entire face, with 2 round glass openings for your eyes. But the most distinctive feature is the long, curved beak that protrudes from where your nose and mouth would be, giving you the appearance of some monstrous bird of prey. The beak extends half a foot or more from your face. You have already prepared the beak's contents. Following the instructions of more experienced plague doctors, You have filled the hollow interior with aromatic substances, dried rose petals, carnations, lavender, peppermint, and perhaps some camphor. Some doctors use more exotic ingredients, ambergris, myrrh, cloves, even theriac, a complex mixture of over 55 herbs and other substances, including cinnamon and honey. The theory is that these powerful fragrances will purify the air before it reaches your nostrils and lungs, counteracting the evil miasma that supposedly carries the plague. You tie the straps behind your head, securing the mask in place. Immediately, your field of vision narrows. You can see only what is directly in front of you, through the two glass circles. Your breathing sounds loud in your ears, echoing within the beak. Each inhalation brings the overpowering scent of the herbs and flowers, so strong it almost makes you dizzy. Finally, you place the wide-brimmed leather hat upon your head, the mark of your profession. In one hand, you take up a wooden cane, an essential tool that you will use to point, to probe, to lift clothing, to keep distance between yourself and the afflicted. The cane is also used to keep crowds away, to prevent people from approaching too closely in their desperation. You are ready. You step out into the street. The town is transformed by plague. You have known this place in healthier times, but now it seems like a different world entirely. Houses that were once alive with activity stand shuttered and silent. Some doors are marked with red crosses, the sign that plague has entered and the inhabitants are to remain within. The cobblestones are slick with waste, for the usual street cleaners have fled or died, and refuse accumulates. The smell reaches you even through your mask. The aromatic herbs in your beak cannot fully mask the odor that pervades everything. The stench of death and decay, mixed with the usual smells of medieval urban life, open sewers, animal waste, rotting garbage. But now there is something more, something worse. The smell of bodies decomposing in homes, of mass graves only partially covered, of disease itself, which seems to have its own particular odor, sweet and sick and wrong. People walk with herbs pressed to their noses, or cloth soaked in vinegar held over their mouths. Some carry nosegays of flowers, desperately trying to cleanse the air around them. But nothing truly helps. The stench is inescapable, a constant reminder that death is not merely near, but everywhere, a presence as tangible as the buildings and the street beneath your feet. As you walk through the narrow lanes, you see the living regard you with a complex mixture of emotions. Some faces show hope, a desperate belief that your presence means help has arrived. Others show only fear. To many, you are not a healer but an omen, a harbinger of death itself. Your beaked mask makes you look inhuman, monstrous. Children cry when they see you. Adults cross themselves and turn away. You have become accustomed to this isolation, this loneliness. You are simultaneously essential and feared, needed and resented. No one invites you to share a meal or a cup of wine. No one meets your eyes with warmth. You exist apart, moving through the town like a ghost, separated from ordinary human connection by your mask and your purpose. Your first call is to a house where a family has reported illness. You knock with your cane, and after a long moment, the door opens a crack. A man's face appears, haggard and frightened. He gestures you inside, backing away as you enter. The interior is dark, the windows shuttered against the supposedly corrupted air. The smell here is even worse than in the street. You breathe shallowly, grateful now for the overwhelming scent of lavender and camphor in your mask, even though you know it provides only psychological comfort. The man leads you to a back room where his wife lies on a pallet. You can see immediately that she is far advanced in the disease. Her face is flushed with fever, her eyes glazed and unseeing. She trembles violently, despite the blankets piled upon her. You use your cane to gently pull back the blanket, exposing her neck and the upper part of her chest. There, you see what you were expecting, the buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that are the hallmark of bubonic plague. One has formed in her neck, distorting the line of her throat. It is grotesquely enlarged, the size of a hen's egg, the skin stretched tight and discolored. You can see that it is filled with fluid, pus, and blood mixed together, and you know from experience that it is excruciatingly painful. The woman moans, a sound of such misery that it cuts through your professional detachment. You have heard this sound many times, but you have not become inured to it. Each patient's suffering is distinct, individual, unbearable to witness. You know what you are supposed to do. You are supposed to treat her according to the medical understanding of your time, an understanding that is, though you do not know it, almost entirely wrong. The theory of humors dominates medical practice. Illness, you have been taught, results from an imbalance in the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The treatment, therefore, is to restore balance, usually by removing excess humors. You prepare to perform bloodletting. Using your cane, you signal to the husband to bring you a basin. You remove a small, sharp blade from your bag. The woman is too weak to resist as you make a careful incision in her arm, allowing blood to flow into the basin. The theory is that you are draining the corrupted blood, the excess humors that have caused the disease. In reality, you are weakening her further, hastening her death. Next, you might attempt another treatment, the application of a live frog or leech to the buboes. The idea is that these creatures will draw out the poison, the bad humors, absorbing them into their own bodies. You have brought leeches with you, kept in a small jar. You use a wooden instrument to place them directly on the swollen nodes. The woman whimpers, but does not have the strength to move away. Sometimes, plague doctors will lance the buboes, cutting them open to drain the pus. This is agonizing for the patient and frequently ineffective, though occasionally it may provide temporary relief from the pressure. Some practitioners even recommend that the patient drink the pus from the lanced buboes, a cure so horrifying that you have never been willing to attempt it. You might also administer various potions and pastes. If the family is wealthy, you might prescribe crushed emeralds mixed with water or food, an impossibly expensive treatment that does nothing. For poorer patients, the remedies are different arsenic or mercury, substances that will poison them faster than the plague itself. Some doctors place a live hen close to the swellings, believing the bird will somehow draw out the pestilence. Others recommend that patients drink their own urine twice daily. These treatments sound absurd, but they represent the best medical knowledge of our age, the desperate attempts of a profession to combat a disease it does not understand. You do what you can for this woman, knowing it will almost certainly not be enough. Before you leave, you take out a small book and make a notation. This is another part of your job, to compile public records of plague deaths. You record the address, the woman's name, the date, the symptoms observed. This ledger will become a chronicle of the town's suffering, a grim census of the dying and dead. The husband asks you, his voice breaking, if there is hope. You do not answer directly. What can you say? That perhaps 8 in 10 who contract bubonic plague will die within 8 days? That the survival rate is devastatingly low? Instead, you murmur something about God's will, about prayer, about keeping her comfortable. Then you leave, your leather coat creaking, your beaked mask turning away from his desperate gaze. The day continues. You move from house to house, street to street. Each visit is much like the last. You examine patients, most already beyond help. You see the buboes in all their grim variety, in the groin, the armpits, the neck. You see the secondary symptoms, the fever, the headaches, the vomiting, the delirium that sets in as the disease progresses. Some patients have developed septicemic plague, an infection of the blood itself. These patients display purple patches on their skin, bruise-like discolorations caused by internal bleeding. They often die so quickly that the characteristic buboes do not have time to form. There is nothing you can do for them at all. You see children, their small bodies ravaged by fever. You see the elderly, the young adults, entire families struck down. The plague does not discriminate. Unlike many diseases which primarily kill the very young and very old, this pestilence affects everyone, cutting down people in the prime of life just as readily as the vulnerable. By midday, you are exhausted. The emotional toll is perhaps greater than the physical strain. You have witnessed so much suffering, so much death, and you know that your efforts make almost no difference. The treatments you offer are useless. The comfort you provide is minimal. You are not truly a healer, but rather a recorder, a witness, a symbol of the town's attempt to maintain some semblance of order and response in the face of catastrophe. And always, there is the fear. Despite your costume, despite the waxed leather and the aromatic herbs and the gloves, and the distance you maintain with your cane, you know you are not safe. You have seen plague doctors fall ill, seen them develop the telltale buboes, seen them die as miserably as any other victim. The costume may provide some protection. The wax does prevent fleas from reaching your skin, and the long beak does keep your face farther from coughing patients, but it is far from foolproof. Each time you enter a plague house, each time you examine a patient, you are risking your life. The fear never entirely leaves you. It sits in your stomach, a cold weight, a constant awareness that you might be the next to fall. You might wake tomorrow with a headache and a fever. You might feel the first painful swelling in your groin or armpit. You might have only days left to live. This psychological burden is immense. You cannot speak of it to anyone. Who would understand? Who would offer comfort to the plague doctor? The townspeople see you as something other than human, a necessary evil, a figure of dread. Your family, if you have one, may have already left, fled to the countryside to escape the contagion. You are alone with your fear, carrying it with you through the darkened streets, into the shuttered houses, through all the long hours of your rounds. In the afternoon, you are called to an area of the town where bodies have accumulated. This is another of your duties, to assist with the removal of corpses to the mass graves. The regular gravediggers and body collectors have died or fled, and so this task, too, falls to you. You find them in a narrow alley, 3 bodies laid out in a row. They have been dead for some time. The smell is overwhelming, even through your mask. Using your cane and working with another plague doctor and a few remaining town laborers, you help load the bodies onto a cart. The bodies are stiff, awkward to move. You try not to look at their faces. Try not to think of them as individuals who once laughed and loved and worried about ordinary things. The cart, piled with the day's dead, is pulled through the streets to the edge of town, where a large pit has been excavated. This is the plague pit, a mass grave where dozens, sometimes hundreds, of victims are interred together. In some places, in the chaos and overwhelming numbers, bodies are simply thrown into pits with little ceremony. But here, in this town, there is still an attempt at dignity. The bodies are arranged in rows, placed carefully so they do not overlap, each wrapped in a simple shroud. It is a small gesture toward respect, a maintenance of humanity in the face of mass death. You watch as the bodies are lowered into the pit. A priest says prayers, his voice thin in the open air. More bodies will be added tomorrow, and the day after, until the pit is full. Then another will be dug. The town is ringed with these plague pits, the earth scarred by mass burials. You return to your rounds. More houses, more patients, more suffering. The rhythm of your days has become monotonous in its grimness. Wake, don the costume, make your rounds, examine the sick, record the dying, assist with body removal, return to your lodgings, remove the costume with careful attention to avoiding contamination. Try to eat something. Try to sleep despite the memories of what you have seen. Sometimes you are called to perform an autopsy, to examine a body and document the plague's effects on the internal organs. This is done in an attempt to better understand the disease, to find patterns that might suggest treatments. You have conducted several such examinations, noting the blackened tissues, the swollen organs, the way the disease ravages the body from within. But the understanding you gain is minimal. The plague remains a mystery, a force that medical knowledge cannot comprehend or combat. As evening comes, you remove your costume with great care. The process of doffing the protective garments is almost as ritualized as putting them on. You must avoid touching the outer surfaces, which may be contaminated. You hang the coat, the gloves, the mask, and you wash your hands and face with water and vinegar, hoping it will provide some protection. You look at yourself in a small mirror. Your face is pale, drawn with exhaustion. Your eyes are shadowed. You look like you are aging rapidly, the stress and fear and constant exposure to death taking a visible toll. You wonder how much longer you can continue this work. You wonder if you will survive long enough to see the plague end. Night falls over the town. From your window, you can see lights in only a few houses. So many are dark, empty, the inhabitants dead or fled. The church bells toll again, marking another death, and another, and another. You try to sleep, but rest does not come easily. You hear the sounds of the plague-stricken town. Distant weeping, the creak of the death cart, the howling of dogs that have gone feral, scavenging among the corpses. You close your eyes and try to think of other things, of a time before the plague, of the possibility of a time after it. But the memories of the day crowd in. The woman with the swollen bubo in her neck, probably dead by now. The children you examined, their small faces flushed with fever. The bodies in the cart, stiff and cold. The smell that seems to have penetrated even your skin. The smell of death that you cannot escape, no matter how you wash. Tomorrow, you will wake and do it all again. You will don the leather coat and the beaked mask. You will walk through the silent streets, entering the houses of the dying, recording their names in your ledger, applying your useless treatments, offering what small comfort you can. You will live with the fear, the isolation, the knowledge that you might be next. This is the rhythm of your life now, the rhythm of a plague doctor's existence in a world consumed by pestilence. And so you continue day after day, a figure in a beaked mask moving through the shadowed streets, simultaneously essential and feared, a witness to one of history's greatest catastrophes, carrying your burden of knowledge and helplessness through the long, grim years of the plague. The weeks blur together, the death toll rises. The mass graves fill and new ones are dug. The town grows quieter as more houses empty. And through it all, you persist, the plague doctor, donning your mask each morning, stepping out into the street, thick with the scent of death that your aromatic herbs cannot quite mask, making your rounds, recording the dying, living with your fear, enduring your isolation, waiting for an end that may never come. The plague transforms more than bodies. It transforms societies, the relationships between those who own land and those who work it, the careful balance of power it has held for centuries. Let us leave behind the beaked mask and the shuttered houses for a time, and step into the decades following the great pestilence, into a world where the old certainties are crumbling, where those who survived the dying have begun to ask questions that were once unthinkable. Imagine yourself in England in the year 1381. 33 years have passed since the Black Death first swept across the land, reducing the population by perhaps a third, maybe even half. The immediate horror has receded, but the world it left behind is fundamentally altered. You might be a peasant, a villain bound to a manor, or perhaps a free laborer, one of the artisans or agricultural workers whose daily toil sustains the realm. The landscape you inhabit is marked by absence. Fields that once were cultivated now lie fallow, overtaken by weeds and wild growth. Villages that once bustled with activity stand partially deserted, houses empty, their former occupants claimed by plague. More than 1,300 villages will be abandoned in England between 1350 and 1500, simply ceasing to exist as viable communities. But this devastation has brought something unexpected, something that troubles the established order: opportunity. Before the plague, labor was abundant. There were always more workers than work, more peasants seeking employment than lords requiring their services. This abundance kept wages low and gave landowners immense power over those who worked their estates. Now, the equation has reversed. There are far fewer workers, but the same amount of land requires cultivation. The wheat must still be planted and harvested. The sheep must still be tended. The mills must still be operated. But there are simply not enough hands to do all the work that needs doing. You, as a laborer, suddenly find yourself in an unfamiliar position. Instead of begging for work, you have multiple lords competing for your services. They offer higher wages, better terms of employment, more freedoms. Where once you might have earned a few pence a day for backbreaking labor from dawn to dusk, now you can command double or even triple that amount. This shift terrifies the landowning class, the nobility and gentry who have always relied on cheap, abundant labor to maintain their wealth and status. They watch with alarm as their workers gain confidence, make demands, even leave their employment to seek better opportunities elsewhere. In 1351, Parliament responds with legislation designed to freeze this new fluidity, to lock workers into their traditional positions. The Statute of Labours attempts to set maximum wages at pre-plague levels and prohibits workers from leaving their employment to seek better pay elsewhere. The law requires that every able-bodied person under 60 without means of support must work for whoever requires their services at the wage rates that prevailed before the plague struck. This statute becomes a deep source of resentment. You and your fellow workers have seen the opportunity for a better life, have tasted the possibility of earning enough to improve your circumstances, to perhaps even move beyond mere subsistence. The law seeks to deny you this, to force you back into poverty despite the changed circumstances, despite the fact that your labor is now demonstrably more valuable. For 30 years, this tension simmers. The laws are enforced unevenly. Some workers manage to extract better wages despite the restrictions. Some lords, desperate for labor, quietly ignore the wage limits. But the resentment grows, a slow accumulation of grievances, a sense that the social order is fundamentally unjust. Then comes the poll tax. In 1377, England is engaged in an expensive and largely unsuccessful war against France. The royal treasury is depleted. The government, needing funds, introduces a new form of taxation, a poll tax, a flat rate charged to every person over the age of 14, regardless of their wealth or ability to pay. This first poll tax, levied at 4 pence per person, is deeply unpopular, but it raises the needed funds. 2 years later, in 1379, a second poll tax is introduced, this time with a sliding scale that charges the wealthy more than the poor. But widespread evasion is a problem, and it raises far less than hoped. In March 1381, Parliament approves a third poll tax in just 4 years. This time, the rate is set at 12 pence per person, triple the original amount, and again it applies to everyone over the age of 15, regardless of their means. For a poor family, this is a crushing burden, perhaps equivalent to several weeks' wages. For the wealthy, it is a minor inconvenience. The government anticipates resistance. When tax collectors report widespread evasion, royal commissioners are appointed with extraordinary powers to investigate non-payment. These commissioners have authority to interrogate village officials, to demand the counting of every person in a community, to identify those who are avoiding the tax. It is one of these confrontations that ignites the rebellion. On May 30th, 1381, a commissioner named Thomas Bampton arrives in the small Essex village of Fobbing, accompanied by his retinue. He has come to demand payment from those who have not yet paid the poll tax. and to extract additional payments from those who have paid to cover those who have not. The villagers of Fobbing, already burdened and resentful, refuse. There are heated words. The situation escalates. Bampton's authority is challenged, then rejected entirely. He and his men are driven from the village, humiliated and threatened. This act of defiance, in itself small, becomes the spark. Word spreads rapidly through Essex and the surrounding counties. Other villages rise in support of Fobbing. When royal soldiers are sent to restore order and punish the rebellious villagers, they too are driven off. Within days, what began as a local tax dispute has become a widespread uprising. The rebellion spreads through Essex and Kent, drawing support from agricultural laborers, artisans, small landowners, and even some wealthier individuals who have their own grievances against the royal government. This is not simply a revolt of the desperately poor, but a broad coalition united by resentment of taxation, of wage controls, of the rigid feudal system that binds them to their stations. A leader emerges from Kent, Wat Tyler. Very little is known about Tyler's background with certainty. He may have been a tiler or roofer by trade, hence his name. He may have had some military experience. What is clear is that he possesses leadership qualities, an ability to organize and direct the growing rebel forces. By early June, Tyler has gathered thousands of followers. The rebels develop a set of demands, grievances they wish to present to the young king, Richard II, who is only 14 years old. They want an end to serfdom, the feudal system that binds peasants to the land and to their lords. They want the freedom to work for employers of their choosing. They want the abolition of the statute of laborers. They want lower taxes. They want the heads of certain royal advisors, whom they blame for the poll tax and for corruption. On June 10th, Tyler leads his Kentish rebels to Canterbury, the seat of the Archbishop and England's most important religious center. The city offers no resistance. The rebels enter without opposition and take control. They force the cathedral monks to swear loyalty to their cause. They search the city for individuals associated with the royal government, dragging suspects from their homes. Some are executed in the streets. The prison is opened and all the inmates freed. Tyler persuades several thousand of the Canterbury rebels to march with him to London. Meanwhile, similar rebel forces are converging on the capital from Essex and other surrounding counties. By June 13th, rebel armies have arrived at the outskirts of London. The young king and his advisors are in the Tower of London, watching the approach of perhaps 30,000 to 60,000 armed and angry subjects. The royal forces are inadequate to resist such numbers, and there is real fear that the city will be overwhelmed. The rebels gain entry to London, crossing London Bridge into the city itself. There is debate among historians about whether they forced their way across or were allowed to enter, possibly by sympathizers among the London populace who share their grievances. Regardless, once inside the city, the rebels begin to take action. They move through the streets with purpose, targeting specific locations and individuals. They destroy legal documents, the records of feudal obligations and debts that bind peasants to their lords. They attack the homes of royal officials and tax collectors. They open prisons and free the inmates. But their most dramatic action is the attack on the Savoy Palace, the magnificent London residence of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, one of the most powerful men in England and uncle to the young king. John of Gaunt is blamed by the rebels for the introduction of the poll tax and for many of the policies they find oppressive. Around 4 in the afternoon on June 13th, the rebel forces, driven by rage and a sense of justice, descend upon the Savoy. The palace is one of the finest buildings in London, filled with treasures, art, fine furniture, jewels, and valuable documents. What happens next is remarkable. The rebels do not loot the palace. Instead, they systematically destroy it. They smash everything that can be broken. Furniture is hacked to pieces. Tapestries are torn down and burned. Jewels are not pocketed, but pulverized with hammers into worthless fragments. Gold and silver objects are thrown into the Thames or cast into fires. The rebels enforce this discipline strictly. When one of their number is discovered to have kept a silver goblet for himself, he is killed by his fellow rebels for violating the principle that this is not theft, but righteous destruction. They are making a statement. This is not about personal enrichment, but about justice, about destroying the symbols of oppression and inequality. The palace is set ablaze. By the end of the day, the Savoy is reduced to ruins, everything of value either destroyed or consumed by fire. The palace will never be rebuilt. The site will serve other purposes in later centuries, but the magnificent residence of John of Gaunt is gone forever, a casualty of popular rage. The king, young Richard II, attempts to negotiate with the rebels. On June 14th, he meets with a large group of them at Mile End, outside the city walls. The rebels present their demands. Remarkably, Richard agrees to many of them. He promises to abolish serfdom, to grant freedom of labor, to pardon the rebels for their actions. In return, the king asks that the rebels return peacefully to their homes. Many do, satisfied with the royal promises, carrying charters of freedom signed by the king. But others remain suspicious. The more radical elements, led by Wat Tyler, do not trust these promises and remain in London. While the king is negotiating at Mile End, another group of rebels enters the Tower of London itself. They search the fortress, hunting for specific royal officials. They find the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, who also serves as Lord Chancellor, one of the most powerful positions in government. They also find Robert Hales, the Lord Treasurer. Both men are blamed for the poll tax and for royal corruption. The rebels drag these men from the tower to nearby Tower Hill. There, without trial, they are beheaded, their heads struck off and mounted on pikes. Several other royal officials are also executed. The young king, still negotiating at Mile End, is powerless to prevent these killings. The next day, June 15th, Richard agrees to another meeting with the remaining rebels, this time at Smithfield, an open area just outside the city walls. Wat Tyler rides forward to speak with the king. The exact sequence of events that follows is disputed, with different chronicles giving varying accounts, but the outcome is clear. Some kind of confrontation occurs. Words are exchanged. Perhaps Tyler is perceived as disrespectful to the king. Perhaps he makes threatening gestures. The mayor of London, William Walworth, moves suddenly and strikes Tyler with his sword, wounding him. One of the king's squires follows up, stabbing Tyler in the stomach. Tyler, mortally wounded, tries to ride back to his followers, but he falls from his horse and is carried to a nearby hospital. He dies there shortly afterward. His head is cut off and displayed on London Bridge as a warning to rebels. The rebels, seeing their leader struck down, are on the verge of attacking the king's small party. The situation is extremely dangerous. Richard, showing courage remarkable for his age, spurs his horse forward and addresses the rebels directly. He tells them he will be their leader now, that their demands will be met, that they should follow him. Whether through the persuasiveness of this appeal, or through confusion and fear after Tyler's death, or simply through exhaustion, the rebel forces disperse. They leave London and begin to return to their homes, many carrying the royal charters of freedom. The revolt, which had seemed on the verge of overthrowing the established order, collapses in a matter of hours. But the rebellion is not truly over. In the days and weeks that follow, royal forces begin a systematic campaign to hunt down and punish those who participated in the uprising. The king's promises, it turns out, are not going to be honored. Richard claims that promises made under duress, under threat, have no legal validity. The charters of freedom are revoked. Possession of such a charter becomes evidence of participation in the rebellion, and therefore grounds for execution. Royal commissioners tour the affected regions, conducting investigations and trials, though many of the trials are mere formalities before predetermined verdicts. The toll is brutal. In Hertfordshire and Essex, some 500 people are executed. In Kent, the number is even higher, perhaps 1,500 sent to the gallows. The Earl of Buckingham leads the royal forces, carrying out what the king calls vengeance, a deliberate campaign to terrorize the population back into submission. John Ball, a priest whose preaching about equality and justice had inspired many of the rebels, is captured. On July 15th, he is hanged, drawn, and quartered in the marketplace at St. Albans as an example to any who might contemplate future rebellion. The rebellion is crushed. The demands are denied. Serfdom continues. The statute of laborers remains in force. The rigid feudal hierarchy is maintained, at least in law. And yet, something has changed. The revolt may have failed in its immediate objectives, but it has demonstrated that the peasantry can organize, can challenge authority, can make the powerful fear. Parliament quietly stops trying to enforce the wage controls as strictly as before, recognizing that such efforts only fuel resentment. Landowners, shaken by the uprising, become more cautious in their treatment of workers. Over the following decades and centuries, serfdom does gradually fade away in England, not through dramatic revolution, but through slow erosion, through the continuing shortage of labor that gives workers leverage, through the economic changes that make the old feudal system increasingly unworkable. The Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt it helped to spark are part of this long transition. Violent punctuation marks in the slow transformation from medieval feudalism towards something different, something more fluid, where labor has value and workers have power. But in 1381, in the immediate aftermath of the revolt, what is most visible is the failure, the executions, the broken promises. The heads of rebels rot on pikes as warnings. The fields are worked as before by those bound to the land. The old order, shaken, has reasserted itself with blood and violence. You, if you survived the rebellion, return to your village, to your daily labor. The dreams of freedom have been crushed. The hope for a better world has been met with the executioner's blade. Life continues much as it had before. The same endless cycle of planting and harvest, the same poverty, the same obligations to lord and king. But you remember. You remember the march on London, the burning of the Savoy, the moment when the king himself made promises, however false they turned out to be. You remember that for a few brief days, the powerless had power, the voiceless had voice. And perhaps, in the long evenings after the day's work is done, you tell these stories to your children, passing down the memory of resistance, the knowledge that the established order is not immutable. That change, however difficult, however costly, is possible. The plague changed more than bodies. It changed the calculus of labor and land, of power and obligation. And though the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was crushed, the forces it represented, the growing confidence of workers, the impossibility of returning to pre-plague conditions, the beginning of the end for feudalism, those forces continued to work beneath the surface, slowly reshaping the world. Let us turn now from the realm of politics and social upheaval to something more interior, more spiritual, though no less disturbing. In this segment, we will explore a religious response to the plague, one that emerged from the deepest wells of medieval piety and fear. We will witness a movement that believed suffering could purchase salvation, that pain could appease an angry God, that blood willingly shed might stay the hand of divine punishment. The flagellants. Even the name carries a certain harsh sound. derived from the Latin word for whip, for scourge. They were religious zealots who emerged in the wake of catastrophe, who saw in the Black Death not merely disease, but divine judgment, God's terrible punishment for humanity's accumulated sins. To understand the flagellants, you must first understand the religious psychology of medieval Europe, the particular way that people of this era conceived of suffering, sin, and salvation. The medieval mind saw direct connections between the physical and spiritual worlds. Disease was not simply the result of natural causes, but could be punishment for moral failings. Disaster could be sent by God to chasten a sinful humanity. The practice of flagellation, of voluntary self-whipping as a form of penance, did not begin with the Black Death. It had roots stretching back centuries, practiced privately by monks and mystics in their cells as a form of mortification of the flesh, a way to discipline the body and its desires. But the public, communal flagellation that characterized the flagellant movement began in the 13th century. The first recorded incident occurred in 1259 in the Italian city of Perugia, a year after severe crop failures and famine had ravaged much of Europe. A spontaneous movement arose in which people began to whip themselves publicly, processing through the streets in organized groups, seeking through their suffering to atone for sins and avert further disaster. This movement spread across northern Italy and into Austria, then subsided. It resurged periodically over the following decades, appearing in 1296 and again in the early 1330s. Each time, it emerged in response to crisis, famine, political turmoil, natural disasters, and each time it eventually faded as the immediate crisis passed or authorities suppressed it. But nothing compared to the outbreak of flagellant fervor that accompanied the Black Death. As plague swept across Europe in 1348 and 1349, the movement exploded with unprecedented scale and intensity. Thousands upon thousands of people, overwhelmed by fear and convinced that the end times were upon them, took up the whip and joined the processions. Imagine yourself in a town in Germany or Austria in the summer of 1349. The plague has already reached your region. You have seen neighbors die, watched as bodies are carried to mass graves, lived with the constant fear that you or your family might be next. The church offers prayers and processions, but these traditional remedies seem powerless against the pestilence. People continue to die by the hundreds, by the thousands. God seems not to hear the ordinary supplications. Then one day, you hear a sound approaching from outside the town. It is singing, but unlike any church hymn, you know. The melody is haunting, repetitive, almost hypnotic. The words speak of sin and judgment, of Christ's suffering, of the need for penance. You go to your window or step outside to see. Down the street comes a procession unlike anything you have witnessed before. Perhaps 300 men walk together in formation, 2 by 2. They wear a distinctive costume, white cloth wrapped around their lower bodies from thigh to ankle, but their torsos are completely bare. On their heads are caps or hoods marked with red crosses, front and back, the symbol of their penitential purpose. Each man carries in his right hand a scourge, a whip with 3 separate tails or cords, and these cords are knotted and sometimes fitted with small metal studs or sharp points designed to pierce the skin. As they walk, they sing their strange hymns, songs they have composed themselves outside the official liturgy of the church. The procession moves to an open square or the space before a church. There, following a pattern that has been carefully established by their leaders, they arrange themselves in a large circle. What happens next is both ritualized and shocking. A public performance of suffering that draws crowds of townspeople to witness. At a signal, the flagellants cast themselves down on the ground, arranging their bodies in positions that represent different sins. A man who has committed adultery lies on his side. A man guilty of perjury lies on his back with 3 fingers raised. Murderers lie face down with their arms outstretched. This is the first part of their ritual, a public confession through gesture and position. They lie there, motionless, while reciting prayers. 5 Our Fathers, according to some accounts, each one offered for a different purpose or intention. The crowd watches in silence. There is something deeply unsettling about this display. These grown men prostrate in the dirt, their bare backs exposed, waiting. Then their leader, called the Master, walks among them. He carries his own scourge, and as he passes each prostrate figure, he strikes him once across the back and commands him to rise, saying words to the effect of, "Stand up, so that God may forgive all of your sins." One by one, the flagellants rise to their knees, and then begins the actual flagellation. The flagellants commence whipping themselves, swinging their scourges over their shoulders to strike their own backs with considerable force. The knotted cords and metal points tear into flesh. Blood begins to flow, running down their backs, staining the white cloth wrapped around their waists. They do this while singing their hymns, verses that call upon God for mercy, that reference Christ's passion and suffering, that beg for forgiveness of sins. One hymn that survives from this period includes the verses, "Now strike us hard through Christ's ire. Through God let our pride leave, so that God has mercy on us." The rhythm of the whipping matches the rhythm of the song. Each beat, each verse, another strike. The sound fills the square. The singing voices, the whistle and crack of the whips, the involuntary gasps and groans as the scourges find their marks. The watching crowd responds with a mixture of horror, fascination, and religious fervor. This is not brief. The ritual continues for an extended period, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes or even longer. By the end, the flagellants' backs are covered in welts and lacerations, blood flowing freely from dozens of small wounds. Some participants reach a state of altered consciousness, whether from the pain, the rhythmic repetition, the religious fervor, or some combination of all 3. Finally, at another signal from the Master, the flagellation ceases. The participants cast themselves down again on the ground, repeating their initial postures of confession. More prayers are recited. Then, with a final invocation, they rise, reform their lines, and process out of the square to continue their journey to the next town. This ritual would be performed twice daily, every day, for the duration of the flagellants' journey. The standard term of commitment was 33.5 days, representing the number of years Christ lived on earth. During this period, the flagellants lived under strict rules established by the movement. They were forbidden to bathe, to change their clothes, to sleep in beds, or to speak with women. They had to beg for their food and could accept no money. They pledged absolute obedience to their master, who led the group and organized the rituals. These rules created a separate community, bound together by their suffering and their mission. The flagellants believed they possessed special spiritual authority, that their suffering granted them a direct relationship with God that bypassed the need for priestly mediation. This was part of what made them threatening to church authorities. They claimed that their blood, voluntarily shed, was as efficacious as the sacraments administered by ordained priests. Central to their ritual was the reading of what they called the heavenly letter. This document, they claimed, had been delivered directly from Christ by an angel, dropped from heaven onto the altar of a church. The letter's message was clear. Humanity had sinned grievously, and God was punishing the world with plague and other disasters. Only through extreme penance, through the shedding of blood and the infliction of suffering, could God's wrath be appeased. The letter called for flagellation, for processions, for public acts of penitence. It promised that those who followed these practices for the prescribed 33.5 days would be cleansed of all sins, granted salvation regardless of their past transgressions. This was an enormously appealing message in a time of terror, offering a concrete action people could take, a promise of protection and salvation when everything else had failed. Initially, the Catholic Church was uncertain how to respond. Some local priests and even friars joined the early flagellant processions, seeing them as an expression of genuine religious devotion, an intensification of traditional penitential practices. The movement seemed to arise from authentic piety, from a population desperate to make sense of the catastrophe engulfing them. But as the movement grew and spread with astonishing rapidity across Germany, Flanders, France, and even crossing the English Channel to England, church authorities became alarmed. The flagellants were attracting massive followings, drawing people away from orthodox religious practices. Their claim of direct divine authority threatened the institutional church's role as mediator between humanity and God. More troubling still were some of the movement's apocalyptic beliefs and the violence that began to accompany their processions. Many flagellants were convinced that the end times were imminent, that the Black Death was the beginning of the final tribulation before Christ's return. This apocalyptic fervor led them to seek scapegoats, groups they could blame for God's anger. Jewish communities became primary targets. The flagellants helped spread and legitimize a horrific accusation that Jews had caused the plague by poisoning wells and water sources. This lie, though condemned by Pope Clement VI and other church leaders, who correctly pointed out that Jews were dying from plague just like Christians, spread widely and contributed to devastating violence. In town after town, flagellant processions were accompanied by or followed by pogroms against Jewish populations. In Erfurt, in March 1349, over 100 Jews were massacred, with some accounts suggesting the number reached 3,000. Many Jews, seeing the mob approaching, chose to set fire to their own homes and perish in the flames rather than face what awaited them. In Worms, on March 1, 1349, over 400 members of the Jewish community were killed when much of the Jewish quarter was set ablaze. The pattern repeated across the Rhineland and throughout Germany. Accusations of well poisoning, often promoted or supported by flagellant preachers, followed by massacres. While recent scholarship has shown that the relationship between flagellants and pogroms was more complex than once believed, that economic and political factors often played larger roles, with local authorities using anti-Jewish violence to cancel debts or seize property. The flagellants' role in spreading the well-poisoning rumors and creating an atmosphere of apocalyptic scapegoating cannot be denied. By late 1349, Pope Clement VI had seen enough. On October 20, 1349, he issued a papal bull formally condemning the flagellant movement. The document criticized their heretical beliefs, their claim to grant forgiveness of sins without priestly intervention, their disruption of normal religious practice, and specifically mentioned their role in shedding the blood of Jews. The Pope instructed all bishops under his authority to suppress flagellant processions, to prohibit their public rituals, to preach against their doctrines. Church inquisitors were directed to investigate and root out the movement. The condemnation was effective, combined with a natural waning of public enthusiasm. As the worst phase of the plague began to pass, the flagellant movement rapidly declined. By 1350, the large public processions had mostly ended. The movement continued in smaller, more secretive forms for some decades, periodically resurging before being suppressed again. But it never regained the massive scale of 1349. What are we to make of the flagellants? They represent a particular response to overwhelming trauma, a psychological and spiritual reaction to catastrophe that defies easy modern understanding. In a world where the normal order had collapsed, where death surrounded everyone, where traditional religious assurances seemed hollow, the flagellants offered something concrete: action, visible suffering, a community of the penitent, and a promise of salvation. Their public self-mutilation can be understood as an attempt to regain control in a situation of utter helplessness. If the plague was God's punishment for sin, then by punishing themselves, by suffering visibly and dramatically, perhaps they could satisfy divine justice and avert further calamity. The blood they shed was an offering, a sacrifice, an attempt to participate in Christ's redemptive suffering. But the movement also reveals darker aspects of human psychology under extreme stress: the need for scapegoats, the ease with which religious fervor can turn to violence against vulnerable minorities, the dangers of apocalyptic thinking that sees the world in stark terms of good and evil, saved and damned. The flagellants believed they were serving God, performing acts of extreme devotion that would benefit not only themselves, but all of humanity. Yet their movement contributed to some of the worst violence of the plague years, helped spread both disease and hatred, and ultimately was condemned by the church they claimed to serve. As evening falls and you watch the last flagellant procession depart your town, heading down the road to the next village, the sound of their singing gradually fading into distance, you might feel a complex mixture of emotions. There is something both deeply disturbing and oddly compelling about what you have witnessed. The sight of those bloodied backs, the sound of the whips striking flesh, the fervent intensity of their devotion, these images will remain with you. Perhaps you wonder if they are right, if their extreme measures might indeed appease God's anger. Perhaps you are repelled by their violence, both against themselves and against others. Perhaps you simply feel the weight of living in a time when such things could emerge, when the world had become so dark that voluntary suffering seemed like a reasonable response. The flagellants have passed through and passed on. The plague continues. And in the quiet of your home, in the safety of your bed, you are left to contemplate the mystery of suffering, the question of divine justice, the many ways that human beings, faced with incomprehensible catastrophe, seek meaning, seek control, seek salvation. The movement will fade, but the questions it embodied: how do we make sense of mass death? How do we respond to divine silence? What sacrifices might purchase our safety? These questions linger in the medieval mind, shaping religious life and practice for generations to come. We have seen the plague doctor walking through stricken streets, the peasants rising in revolt, the flagellants seeking atonement through blood. Now, in this final segment, let us turn our attention to those who had the means to escape, to those who chose flight over endurance, comfort over risk. We will explore the world of the wealthy during plague time, the way that privilege could purchase distance from death, and the moral complexities of survival. In the spring of 1348, plague arrives in Florence, that jewel of Italian cities, center of art and commerce and learning. The disease reaches the city in March and rages through the densely packed streets until July, 4 months of unrelenting death. A young writer named Giovanni Boccaccio, 28 years old, witnesses the catastrophe firsthand. What he sees will haunt him, will inspire him to write one of the masterworks of medieval literature. Boccaccio later estimates that more than 100,000 people died within the walls of Florence during those 4 months, more than half the city's population. Whether this number is precisely accurate or somewhat inflated by the horror of memory, the scale of death was undeniably immense. The infected died within 3 days of showing symptoms. Bodies lay in the streets. The living could barely manage to bury the dead. But Boccaccio's great work, the Decameron, does not focus primarily on the suffering in the plague-stricken city. Instead, it tells the story of escape, of 10 young people, 7 women, and 3 men who flee Florence to take shelter in a villa in the countryside. There, in isolation, in comfort, they pass the time telling stories to one another, 100 teles told over 10 days. This frame narrative is not purely fictional. It reflects a real strategy employed by the wealthy across Europe during plague outbreaks. Retreat to rural estates where population density was lower, where the air was thought to be cleaner, where distance from the urban masses might provide protection. Imagine yourself among this privileged class in 14th century Italy, or France, or England. You are a member of the nobility, or perhaps a wealthy merchant family. You own property in the city, a fine townhouse with multiple stories, furnished with the best that money can buy. But you also own estates in the countryside, manor houses or villas surrounded by agricultural lands worked by peasants. When news reaches you that plague has appeared in the city, perhaps in a neighboring district or even closer, you face a choice that poorer citizens do not have. You can stay and face the pestilence, or you can leave, can gather your household and retreat to your rural property. The decision seems obvious. Why would anyone remain in a plague city if they had the means to escape? And so you begin preparations. You select which members of your household will accompany you. Your immediate family, certainly. But what of your servants? You will need servants in the countryside. The villa must be staffed, meals must be prepared, the estate must be maintained. So you choose carefully among your household staff, taking those you trust, those who appear healthy, those whose skills will be necessary. The others are left behind, released from service, or simply abandoned to whatever fate awaits them in a plague-stricken city. You load wagons with your possessions, with clothing and linens, with valuable items you do not wish to leave vulnerable to looting in your absence. You bring food and wine, books perhaps, musical instruments, anything that will make your exile more comfortable. Then, one morning in early spring, as the plague tightens its grip on the city, you depart. Your carriage or wagon moves through streets that are already quieter than they should be, past houses marked with signs of contagion, past churches where the bells toll constantly for the dead. You pass through the city gates, and the countryside opens before you. The journey to your rural estate might take hours or days, depending on distance. As the city recedes behind you, you begin to feel a sense of relief, of escape. Each mile traveled is a mile of separation from the pestilence, a buffer of space that might preserve your life. You arrive at your villa. Perhaps it is a substantial stone building, 2 or 3 stories, with thick walls that keep it cool in summer and warm in winter. It stands on a rise of land, with views across cultivated fields and orchards. The air here smells different from the city of growing things, of earth and trees, without the accumulated odors of crowded urban life. The estate has been prepared for your arrival. The servants who remained here year-round, tending the lands and maintaining the buildings, have readied the villa. Rooms have been aired and cleaned. Fresh linens have been placed on beds. The kitchen is stocked with provisions from the estate's own production flour from wheat grown in its fields vegetables from its gardens, meat from its livestock. You settle into a rhythm of life that is, remarkably, comfortable despite the catastrophe devastating the world beyond your gates. The estate is largely self-sufficient, producing most of what you need. The peasants who work your lands continue their labors, planting and tending crops, caring for animals, maintaining the property. Your days take on a certain pattern. You rise late, perhaps having no pressing business to conduct. Breakfast is served in a pleasant room with windows overlooking the gardens. The gardens are one of the great pleasures of the estate, carefully designed spaces that serve both aesthetic and practical purposes. Medieval gardens of the wealthy were elaborate affairs. Your garden might include a hortus conclusus, an enclosed garden, surrounded by walls or hedges to create a private space. Within these walls, there are raised beds planted with flowers, roses certainly, and lily, violets, irises, and many other varieties chosen for their beauty and fragrance. There are herbs for cooking and medicine, laid out in neat patterns. The garden includes shaded walks where you can stroll in the heat of the day, paths lined with trees or covered arbors draped with vines. There might be fountains, the sound of moving water adding to the pleasant atmosphere. Some wealthy estates have aviaries where exotic birds are kept, their songs filling the air. Others have fish ponds stocked with carp and other fish, serving both as a food source and as a decorative feature. Beyond the formal gardens, the estate includes orchards of fruit trees, and beyond those, woods that provide hunting and further privacy. Some estates are so extensive, they might be described as private parks, enclosed areas of many acres containing diverse landscapes, meadows, forests, streams, ponds. You spend hours in these gardens, walking the paths, sitting in the shade, breathing air that seems impossibly clean after the confined, stinking streets of the city. It is almost possible to forget, here among the roses and singing birds, that plague is ravaging the world. Meals are events of leisure and abundance. Despite the plague, there is no shortage of food here on the estate. The tables are laden with multiple courses roasted meats, game birds, fish from the ponds, fresh bread, cheeses, fruits preserved from last season's harvest. Wine flows freely from the estate's own cellars. The meals last for hours, punctuated by conversation, by laughter. You and your companions tell stories, share gossip from before the flight, discuss philosophy or literature or courtly love. The servants move quietly, refilling cups, bringing new dishes, and withdrawing to leave you to your entertainments. After meals, there are diversions. If the day is fine, you might walk in the gardens or ride out to inspect the estate's lands. There are musical instruments, lutes, harps, and someone in your party is inevitably skilled enough to play while others sing. There are games, chess, dice, cards to pass the time. In the Decameron, Boccaccio's characters engage in storytelling as their primary entertainment, each person taking turns to narrate a tale on an assigned theme. Whether your actual household does the same, certainly there are stories shared, memories recounted, debates about hypothetical scenarios, or questions of courtly behavior. The days blend together in a succession of pleasant, unhurried hours. The weather warms as spring turns to summer. The gardens bloom. The fields around the estate grow green with crops. From your vantage point in this rural idyll, the plague seems distant, almost abstract. But it is not truly absent. News filters in from the city, brought by travelers or by messages sent by those you left behind. The reports are terrible. Thousands dead. Entire families wiped out. Churches overwhelmed. Mass graves dug beyond the city walls. Some of your friends and acquaintances are among the dead. Your own city residence might have been looted, though this concerns you less than the human losses. The servants you brought with you hear news of their own families, relatives left behind in the city who have fallen ill or died. You see grief in their faces, but they continue their duties, serving your meals, maintaining the villa, because what choice do they have? Their employment here has likely saved their lives, but it has also separated them from loved ones in their hour of greatest need. This raises questions, moral complexities, that perhaps trouble your thoughts in the quiet moments. Is it right that you are here, safe and comfortable, while the poor of the city die in their thousands? Do you have obligations to those less fortunate, duties that your flight has abandoned? Boccaccio himself, in his introduction to the Decameron, describes different responses people had to the plague. Some locked themselves away and lived soberly, avoiding all excess, hoping that moderation would protect them. Others did the opposite, indulging in every pleasure, drinking and making merry, believing they might die tomorrow, so they should enjoy today. Still others, like his fictional characters, and presumably many real wealthy citizens, simply fled. He notes the breakdown of social bonds, the way that fear dissolved ordinary human compassion. Families abandoned their sick relatives. The dying were left to perish alone. Bodies lay unburied, because no one would risk approaching them. The social fabric that normally held communities together simply disintegrated under the weight of terror. But you, in your rural retreat, are insulated from the worst of this social collapse. Your household maintains its hierarchies and proprieties. Meals are served at proper times. Social rituals are observed. It is almost like a normal, if unusually leisurely, existence. The class divide that has always existed becomes, during plague time, quite literally a matter of life and death. The poor, crowded together in urban tenements, lacking the resources to flee or isolate, die in disproportionate numbers. The wealthy, who can retreat to spacious rural estates with their own food supplies and small, selected households, have significantly better survival odds. This is not to say that the plague spares the nobility entirely. Many wealthy and powerful individuals do fall victim nobles, bishops, even royalty in some cases. The disease does not respect rank, and even the wealthy must employ servants who might carry infection, must have contact with the outside world in some form. But their overall mortality rate is lower than that of the urban poor. The weeks pass. High summer arrives. News from the city suggests that the plague is perhaps beginning to wane, that the daily death toll is declining. You and your household begin to discuss the possibility of return. But there is no urgency to this discussion. The villa is pleasant. The gardens are at their peak of summer bloom. The heat of the day is more bearable here in the country than it would be in the stone-paved, sun-baked streets of the city. You extend your stay. Perhaps you remain until autumn, until the first cool breezes hint at the coming winter, until you receive word that the city is truly safe again, that the pestilence has run its course. Only then do you begin preparations for the return journey. When you finally re-enter Florence or London or Paris or whatever city you fled, you find it transformed. The streets are emptier, less crowded. So many houses stand vacant, their inhabitants dead, and no heirs to claim them. Entire neighborhoods might be partially abandoned, but there are also opportunities. Property values have dropped. Businesses that lost their owners are available for purchase. For those with capital, the post-plague years become a time of acquisition, of consolidating wealth, of rising in status. The wealthy, having survived by virtue of their ability to escape, now profit from the deaths of others. This concentration of wealth in the hands of those who could afford to isolate themselves accelerates existing economic trends. Merchant families grow more powerful, transitioning from trade to finance, lending money to cash-strapped nobles and even to kings. Some merchant families will eventually rise to rule entire cities. The Medici in Florence are the most famous example of this trajectory. The experience of plague isolation also changes how the wealthy think about their properties. Those country estates that provided refuge become more valued, more invested in. Gardens and pleasure grounds are expanded. The idea of the rural villa as a place of retreat, of escape from urban pressures, becomes firmly embedded in upper-class culture. For you, safely returned to your city residence, life gradually returns to something approaching normalcy. The trauma of the plague year fades, becomes a memory, a story to tell. You have survived where so many others perished. Your wealth provided the means of survival, the rural estate, the ability to remove yourself from danger, the resources to maintain comfort even in isolation. But perhaps, in quiet moments, you remember those you left behind. The servants dismissed from your household, who may have died in the plague, the neighbors who could not flee, the overwhelming mass of the urban core, who had no choice but to remain in the stricken city and take their chances with the pestilence. And perhaps you feel some measure of guilt, or perhaps you feel entirely justified in your actions. You saved yourself and your family. Is this not the natural right of anyone with the means to do so? Must you sacrifice yourself out of solidarity with those less fortunate? These are questions without easy answers, moral dilemmas that the plague raised in sharp relief. The memory of those months in the countryside persists: the pleasant gardens, the leisurely meals, the stories and songs, the curious suspension from normal life. It was, in its way, almost idyllic, a strange interlude of peace and comfort in the midst of catastrophe. That such ease could coexist with such massive suffering, separated only by a few miles of distance, reveals something fundamental about the inequalities of your world. Boccaccio's Decameron, with its framed story of comfortable isolation, will endure for centuries as both a literary masterpiece and a document of how the privileged navigated catastrophe. The 100 tales his characters tell are varied comic, tragic, bawdy, moral, but the frame that contains them remains constant. A small group of wealthy young people, safe in their villa, entertaining themselves while the world burns. This image, this reality, of noble isolation during plague time, captures something essential about the medieval world and perhaps about human nature itself. When catastrophe strikes, those with resources can purchase distance, can buy safety, can maintain their comfort even as others suffer. And life continues for the survivors, much as it always has, with the wealthy in their estates and the poor in their struggles, the fundamental hierarchies of society preserved even through the most devastating of plagues. Imagine yourself waking before dawn, but it is not the gentle stirring of a child's natural rhythm. It is the rough hand of an overseer, or perhaps your own father, shaking you from whatever brief, fitful sleep you manage to find on a thin straw mattress shared with siblings in a cramped, damp room that reeks of mildew and too many bodies. You are 7 years old, perhaps 6. The exact age does not matter much because no one has asked for proof, and you have been working in the mill for as long as you can clearly remember. You are a scavenger. That is the term used for children who perform your particular task, though it is not a term that conveys honor or skill. You crawl beneath the operating machinery, the great looms and spinning frames that clatter and hum and never stop, and you collect the loose cotton fibers that fall and tangle there. The space beneath the machines is low and tight, and the machines themselves are always moving, always dangerous. The belts whir past your head. The gears turn inches from your fingers. One moment of inattention, one slip, and you could be caught, crushed, or scalped. This is not an occasional fear. This is a constant reality. Children are maimed and killed in these mills with a grim regularity that has become almost normalized. You have seen it. Perhaps you witnessed a boy whose hand was caught in a spinning frame, the bones crushed beyond repair. Perhaps you heard the screams of a girl whose long hair, which she was too exhausted to tie back properly, was seized by a moving belt and torn from her scalp. These moments are horrifying, but they are also brief. The machines do not stop. The work continues. There is always more cotton to gather, always another shift to complete. The noise is unimaginable to someone who has never stood inside a textile mill. It is not simply loud, it is all-consuming, a wall of sound that batters your ears and makes thought difficult. The clatter of looms, the whir of spindles, the grinding of gears, the shouts of overseers trying to be heard over the din. It all blends into a relentless, throbbing roar that fills your head and never leaves, even when you finally escape the mill floor at the end of your shift. Some children go deaf. You are not sure if you are going deaf, or if you have simply learned to exist inside the noise, as if it were water and you are learning to breathe beneath it. And then there is the dust. The cotton dust hangs in the air like a thick, choking fog. It coats your skin, clogs your nostrils, fills your lungs with every breath. The air itself feels heavy, almost solid, and you are always coughing dry, hacking coughs that shake your small frame and bring up nothing but more dust. The children who work in the mills often develop respiratory diseases. You do not know this term, but you know that many of the older children, those who have been working for years, have a grayish pallor to their skin and wheeze when they breathe, as if their lungs are struggling to find air in the dust-thick atmosphere. You work 12 hours a day, sometimes 14, sometimes 16. The exact number depends on the demands of production, the whims of the mill owner, the season. In winter, you arrive at the mill before the sun rises and leave long after it is set. You do not see daylight for days, sometimes weeks at a time. Your world becomes the mill floor, the dim glow of gas lamps, the shadows cast by the massive machines. You forget what the sky looks like. You forget what it feels like to run freely or play. Childhood, as something distinct and precious, does not exist for you. It is an abstraction, a luxury afforded to children whose parents can afford to send them to school instead of to the mills. Your wages are a pittance. You earn perhaps a shilling or two per week, less than 1/8 of what an adult worker earns for labor that is often no more skilled than yours. But your family needs this money desperately. Your father may be a laborer whose wages are insufficient to feed the family. Your mother may be dead, or working herself, or caring for younger siblings who are not yet old enough to work. The money you bring home is the difference between eating a bit of bread and going hungry, between keeping the room you share with a dozen others and being turned out into the street. And so you work. You crawl beneath the machines, your small body moving through spaces an adult could never fit. You gather the cotton, hand it up to the adult workers, and crawl back under. Your knees are bruised and scraped. Your hands are rough and calloused. Your back aches from the constant bending and crawling. You are always tired, so tired that you sometimes fall asleep standing up, swaying on your feet, your eyes closing for just a moment. This is when the beatings come. The overseers carry straps or sticks, and they use them liberally. If you are caught dozing, you are struck hard enough to jolt you awake, hard enough to leave welts that sting for days. The overseers do not do this out of cruelty, exactly, though some are certainly cruel. They do it because the machines cannot stop, and if you are not working, you are slowing production, and if you slow production, the mill owner loses money, and if the mill owner loses money, the overseer may lose his job. And so the strap comes down again and again, and you learn to keep your eyes open no matter how heavy they feel. You eat your meals, if they can be called meals, on the mill floor amid the dust and debris. A piece of bread, perhaps a bit of cheese if the week has been good. You eat quickly, mechanically, your hands still dirty from the cotton, your mouth dry from the dust. There is no time to savor the food, no moment of rest or pleasure. You eat because you must, because your body demands fuel, however meager, to continue moving. The mill itself is a towering structure of brick and iron, its windows often broken or covered with grime, its interior damp and poorly ventilated. In summer, the heat is stifling, the air thick and suffocating. In winter, the cold seeps through the walls and floor, and you shiver as you work, your breath misting in front of you. The factory is owned by a man you have never met, a man whose name you may not even know. He lives somewhere far from here, in a grand house with gardens and servants, and he has likely never set foot on the mill floor where you spend your days. You live in a building owned by the mill, a cramped, squalid structure where dozens of families are packed into rooms that were never meant to hold so many people. The walls are thin. The roof leaks. There is no privacy, no cleanliness, no escape from the smell of unwashed bodies and overflowing chamber pots. Disease spreads easily in such conditions. Children sicken and die with alarming frequency, their small bodies unable to withstand the combined assault of overwork, malnutrition, and unsanitary living conditions. Your growth has been stunted by the years of labor and poor diet. You are smaller than children your age who do not work in mills, your limbs thin and underdeveloped, your posture already bent from the constant crawling and stooping. You will carry the physical marks of this childhood for the rest of your life if you survive to adulthood at all. Many children do not. They are killed in accidents, or they succumb to disease, or they simply waste away, their bodies exhausted beyond recovery. There is no school for you, no lessons, no books. You cannot read or write, and you likely never will. The world of ideas, of stories, of knowledge, it is close to you, as distant and unreachable as the life of the mill owner himself. Your world is small and bounded by the walls of the factory and the tenement. You know the rhythm of the machines, the texture of cotton, the weight of exhaustion. These are the lessons of your childhood. And yet, for all its horror, this life is also ordinary. It is the life of thousands upon thousands of children across industrial Britain. By the 1830s, children make up nearly half the workforce in some textile mills. Your suffering is not unique. It is systemic, woven into the fabric of the industrial economy as surely as the cotton threads are woven into cloth. The machines demand constant feeding, constant tending, and children are cheap, plentiful, and small enough to crawl into spaces adults cannot reach. The law, such as it exists, offers little protection. The Factory Act of 1819 prohibited children under 9 from working in cotton mills, but it included no enforcement mechanism, and so it was widely ignored. The Regulation of Child Labor Law of 1833 established inspectors to enforce limits on working hours, no more than 9 hours a day for children aged 9 to 13. But even this law has loopholes, and many mill owners find ways around it. Besides, the inspectors are few, and the mills are many, and it is easy for an owner to hide violations when an inspection is announced in advance. Parliament has heard testimony about the conditions in the mills. Reports have been compiled. Reformers have spoken passionately about the exploitation of children, the brutal hours, the horrific accidents. And yet the reforms come slowly, grudgingly, because the mills are profitable, and profit is a powerful argument. The industrial economy depends on cheap labor, and children are the cheapest labor of all. You do not think much about the future. The future is an abstraction, as distant and unreal as the past. You think about the present, about surviving the next shift, about avoiding the overseer's strap, about not falling asleep and being caught by the machines. You think about food, about warmth, about the brief hours of rest that are never quite enough. Sometimes, in the rare moments when you are outside the mill, you see other children who are clean and well-fed, children who laugh and play, children who are going to school. You do not envy them, exactly. Envy requires a belief that their life could be your life, and you do not believe that. Their world and yours are separated by an unbridgeable gulf. They are children. You are a worker. These are simply the facts of existence. And so the days blur together. Dawn to dusk, dusk to dawn. The clatter of the looms, the choke of the dust, the ache of your body, the weight of your exhaustion. You are 7 years old, and you are already old in ways that matter. Your body is breaking. Your spirit is dulled by the relentless grind of survival. You are one small figure in a vast industrial machine, and the machine does not care about your suffering. It only cares that you continue to feed it cotton, Continue to crawl beneath its gears. Continue to work until you can work no more. This is your childhood. This is your life. And across Britain, in mill towns from Lancashire to Yorkshire, thousands of other children are living the same life, their small bodies bent to the same tasks, their futures shaped by the same brutal logic of industrial capitalism. The machines clatter on. The cotton dust hangs in the air. And you crawl beneath the looms, gathering the loose fibers, trying not to fall asleep, trying not to think about how many more hours remain before you can rest, trying simply to survive. Let us move now from the mill floor, from the world of children crawling beneath machines, to the world of the adults who once operated those machines with pride and skill. Let us step back a few years, to the early months of 1811, when the night air in Nottinghamshire began to fill with the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. The textile workers of England, the weavers and croppers and framework, knitters, had spent their lives learning their trades. These were skilled crafts, passed down through generations, requiring years of apprenticeship to master. A weaver did not simply operate a loom. He understood the tension of the threads, the rhythm of the shuttle, the subtle adjustments needed to produce fabric of quality and beauty. A cropper, who finished woolen cloth by shearing its surface smooth, wielded heavy shears with precision and strength, his work transforming rough fabric into something worthy of sale. These were men who took pride in their labor, men whose skill gave them a certain dignity and independence, even in an economy increasingly hostile to both. And then came the machines. The power loom, the shearing frame, the wide stocking frame. These were not new inventions in 1811, but their proliferation was accelerating, and their impact was becoming impossible to ignore. A power loom, driven by water or steam, could produce fabric far faster than a hand weaver, and it could be operated by someone with minimal training. A shearing frame could finish cloth more quickly and uniformly than a skilled cropper. And perhaps most galling of all, these machines could be tended by workers who earned far less than the skilled craftsmen they replaced, workers who were sometimes women or children whose labor came cheap and whose presence drove wages down for everyone. For the skilled textile workers, this was not simply an economic inconvenience. It was an existential threat. Their livelihoods, their identities, their place in society, all of it was being undermined by machines. It could do in hours what had once taken days, and do it with operators who commanded none of the respect or wages that skill had once guaranteed. And so, in the autumn of 1811, in the hosiery districts around Nottingham, the frames began to break. The first attacks were nocturnal affairs. Groups of men, their faces blackened with soot or covered with masks, would gather in the darkness and march to a workshop where new frames had been installed. They moved with purpose and discipline, breaking down doors, smashing the offending machinery with hammers and hatchets, and disappearing back into the night before the authorities could respond. The destruction was not random or chaotic. The attackers knew which machines to target, the wide frames that could produce cheap, inferior goods, undercutting the market for quality work. The frames operated by employers who paid in goods rather than cash, a practice known as truck that forced workers into a cycle of debt. The attacks spread. From Nottinghamshire, the disturbances moved into Derbyshire and Leicestershire. By early 1812, they had reached Yorkshire and Lancashire, the great centers of the woolen and cotton industries. In each region, the pattern was similar. Night raids, targeted destruction, swift withdrawal. The authorities were baffled and alarmed. Who were these men? What did they want? Were they organized? Or was this simply spontaneous anger? The answer, insofar as there was one, came in the form of letters. The letters began appearing in November 1811. They were addressed to mill owners, magistrates, and government officials. Some were crudely written, the spelling erratic, the grammar rough. Others were more polished, their language sharp and articulate. but all of them carried a similar message. Stop using the machines or face the consequences. And all of them were signed with variations of the same name: Ned Luth, General Luth, King Luth. No one knew who Ned Luth was, or if he was anyone at all. The legend varied, but one common version held that he was a young apprentice from Leicestershire, who, when reprimanded by his master, had smashed a stocking frame in a fit of rage. Whether this event had ever actually occurred was unclear, and it hardly mattered. Ned Luth had become something larger than a person. He was a symbol, a rallying point, a way for anonymous protesters to claim a collective identity and authority. One letter, addressed to a hosier in Bulwell, was among the earliest to invoke Luth's name. It was blunt and threatening. "Sir, if you do not pull down the frames or stop pay Homen, goods only for work extra work or miek in full fashion, my company will vie sit year machines for execution a guy, NST, scene C." The message was clear. Comply with the workers' demands, or watch your property burn. Another letter, sent to a manufacturer who owned shearing frames, was even more explicit. Information has been given that you are the holder of those detestable shearing frames. I shall send one of my lieutenants with at least 300 men to destroy them and burn your building to ashes. It was signed by King Luth. The letters were effective because they carried the implicit threat of coordinated violence. Whether or not a unified Luddite organization actually existed was almost irrelevant. The perception that it did, that there was a General Luth commanding hundreds or thousands of disciplined men, was enough to instill fear in mill owners and magistrates alike. And the threats were not idle. Factories were attacked. Machines were smashed. In some cases, buildings were set ablaze. The Luddites moved with a precision that suggested planning and coordination, striking quickly and vanishing before troops could arrive to stop them. The workers involved in these raids often came from the communities where the attacks took place, men whose neighbors and kin would not betray them, men who could blend back into their daily lives after a night of machine breaking. The violence was not confined to property. In April 1812, a group of Luddites in Yorkshire attacked Rawfolds Mill, owned by a manufacturer named William Cartwright. Cartwright had fortified his mill, installing guards and preparing for an assault. When the Luddites arrived, perhaps 150 men or more, they were met with gunfire. The attackers returned fire, but they could not breach the mill's defenses, and after a fierce exchange, they retreated, leaving behind 2 of their number who had been mortally wounded. The failed attack at Rawfolds marked a turning point. The Luddites had shed blood, and blood would be demanded in return. The government's response was swift and severe. Troops were deployed to the affected regions, thousands of soldiers, more than were serving in the Peninsular War against Napoleon at the time. Magistrates offered rewards for information, leading to the arrest of machine breakers. Spies and informants were recruited to infiltrate the Luddite networks. And in February 1812, Parliament passed the Frame Breaking Act, which made the destruction of textile machinery a capital offense, punishable by death. The act was a harsh escalation. Previously, machine breaking had been treated as a property crime, subject to fines or imprisonment. Now it carried the same penalty as murder. The message was clear. The government would not tolerate any challenge to the march of industrial progress, no matter how desperate the circumstances of those being displaced. The arrests began. In Yorkshire, in the wake of the Rawfolds attack, dozens of men were detained, their homes searched, their movements scrutinized. Some were turned in by informants' neighbors or acquaintances who had been promised money or immunity in exchange for betraying the Luddites. Others were simply unlucky, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, or linked to the movement by circumstantial evidence. In January 1813, a special tribunal was convened in York to try the accused Luddites. The trials were swift, the verdicts largely predetermined. 64 men were tried. 17 were sentenced to death. Many others were sentenced to transportation exile to the penal colonies of Australia, a sentence that often amounted to a living death, given the conditions of the voyage and the brutality of life in the colonies. On the morning of January 16, 1813, 14 of the condemned men were hanged at York Castle. They were brought out in 2 groups, 7 in the morning and 7 in the afternoon, executed on the same gallows, the platform still warm from the first batch when the second group mounted it. The executions were public, attended by vast crowds, and guarded by soldiers on horseback and on foot, a display of state power meant to intimidate anyone who might consider following the Luddites' example. The condemned men went to their deaths with varying degrees of composure. Some sang hymns. Some proclaimed their repentance for having sinned against God and country, though they were often vague about the specific crimes for which they had been convicted. One man, John Hill, addressed the crowd directly. "Friends, all take warning by my fate. For 3 years I followed the Lord, but about half a year since I began to fall away, and fell by little and little, and at last I am come to this. Persevere in the ways of godliness, and take warning by my fate." Another, Joseph Crowther, called out simply, "Farewell, lads." And then the platform dropped, and the men were dead. The mass execution at York was the largest single act of state violence against the Luddites, but it was not the only one. Executions took place in other cities, as well in Chester, in Lancaster, and the threat of the gallows hung over the textile districts like a shadow. The movement, already fragmented and disorganized, began to collapse under the weight of repression. By 1816, the Luddite uprisings had largely ceased. But what were the Luddites fighting for? Were they, as some have claimed, simply backward-looking men who foolishly opposed progress? Were they anti-technology Luddites in the modern sense of the word, irrational enemies of innovation? The answer is more complicated. The Luddites were not opposed to machinery as such. Many of them had worked with machines, looms, frames, tools of various kinds for their entire lives. What they opposed was the way the new machines were being used, to drive down wages, to eliminate skilled labor, to produce inferior goods that flooded the market and undercut quality craftsmanship. They were not against progress. They were against a version of progress that enriched factory owners while immiserating workers, that treated human labor as infinitely disposable, that valued profit over people. In their letters and proclamations, the Luddites articulated a vision of economic justice that was, in its way, deeply conservative. They wanted fair wages, stable employment, respect for skill and craftsmanship. They wanted employers to honor traditional practices, to pay in cash rather than goods, to maintain quality standards. These were not revolutionary demands. They were the demands of men who wanted to preserve a way of life that was being systematically destroyed by the forces of industrial capitalism. But the forces arrayed against them were too powerful. The government, the factory owners, the inexorable logic of mechanization, all of it combined to crush the Luddite movement. By the mid-1810s, the power loom was becoming ubiquitous in the cotton industry. By the 1820s, wages for hand weavers had collapsed. By the 1840s, the trade itself was disappearing, the once proud craft of hand weaving reduced to a relic of a bygone era. The Luddites had lost, the machines had won, and the skilled workers who had once held a place of dignity in the economic order found themselves displaced, their labor devalued, their futures uncertain. And yet, the Luddite uprisings left a mark on history. They demonstrated that the march of industrial progress was not inevitable, not universally welcomed, not without human cost. They showed that workers could organize, could resist, could fight back, even if their fight was ultimately doomed. And they raised questions that remain relevant today. Who benefits from technological change? What is the cost of progress? What obligations do employers and governments have to those whose livelihoods are destroyed by economic transformation? The men hanged at York did not live to see these questions answered. They died defending a world that was already slipping away. A world where skill mattered, where labor had dignity, where a man could take pride in the work of his hands. Their deaths were meant to be a warning, a deterrent, a demonstration of the state's power to punish those who defied the logic of industrial capitalism. But perhaps they were also a testament to the courage of men who refused to go quietly, who chose to fight even when the odds were overwhelmingly against them, who smashed the machines not out of ignorance or fear, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that those machines represented a future in which they had no place. The Luddite rebellion ended. The machines continued their relentless advance. And the children, those small figures we met in the first segment, crawling beneath the looms, breathing the cotton dust, inherited the world the Luddites had tried and failed to prevent. Let us move forward now, 4 decades from the Luddite uprisings, to the year 1851. The machines have won. The power looms clatter in thousands of mills across Britain. The steam engines turn ceaselessly, their pistons rising and falling with mechanical precision. And in London, in Hyde Park, something extraordinary is taking shape, a building unlike any the world has ever seen. It is called the Crystal Palace. Imagine, if you will, a structure made almost entirely of glass and iron, 900,000 square feet of exhibition space, 1,851 feet long, a deliberate echo of the year itself, rising to a height of 128 feet. More than 60,000 panes of glass catch the light, transforming the building into a glittering cathedral of industry and progress. It is 3 times the size of St. Paul's Cathedral, yet it was erected in just 9 months. Its prifated, iron-frame components manufactured in Birmingham and Smethwick, assembled on-site with a speed that seems almost miraculous. Inside, beneath the soaring glass roof, trees grow undisturbed Hyde Park's elms, which the designers chose to enclose rather than fell, creating the illusion that nature itself has been tamed and incorporated into this monument to human achievement. Statues line the walkways, fountains play, and everywhere, in every direction, are the exhibits, more than 14,000 of them, drawn from Britain, its empire, and nations around the world. On May 1st, 1851, Queen Victoria opens the great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations. She is accompanied by Prince Albert, whose vision and patronage made this spectacle possible. A crowd of 25,000 fills the Crystal Palace for the opening ceremony. Over the next 5 months, 6 million people will pass through its doors. A staggering number in a nation whose entire population is just over 20 million. They come by train, by carriage, on foot. They come from the cities and the countryside, from the middle classes and the working classes, though admission prices ensure that the poorest, those children still crawling beneath the looms, will likely never see the inside of this palace built, in part, on their labor. What do these millions of visitors see? They see the accumulated wonders of the industrial age, arranged in vast halls and categorized by nation and type. They see raw materials and machinery, textiles and furniture, musical instruments and precious jewels. They see, in essence, a curated vision of progress, a narrative that tells them Britain stands at the pinnacle of human achievement, that the suffering and displacement of the past decades has been worth it, that the future will be one of endless improvement and prosperity. Let us walk among the exhibits, slowly, calmly, and consider what is on display. In the machinery section, dominating the space, is a massive hydraulic press, the largest object in the entire exhibition. This press was designed by Robert Stephenson to lift the enormous iron tubes of the Britannia Bridge at Bangor in Wales. Each tube weighed 1,144 tons, and yet this press, operated by a single man, could raise them into position with ease. It is a demonstration of power, of the ability of human ingenuity to move objects of almost unimaginable weight, to reshape the physical world on a scale that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. Nearby is a steam hammer, equally impressive in its way. This hammer can forge the main bearing of a steamship with tremendous force, or, with delicate precision, crack an egg without shattering the shell. It is a paradox-made metal. Brutal strength and exquisite control embodied in the same machine. Visitors stand and watch as the hammer rises and falls, demonstrating both its power and its versatility. And they marvel at the cleverness of the engineers who designed it. There are steam engines everywhere, engines of all sizes and configurations. Their brass fittings polished to a mirror shine, their iron frames painted in bold colors. Some are massive, designed to power entire factories. Others are smaller, more specialized, built to drive threshing machines or printing presses or locomotives. A visitor can trace, in these engines, the evolution of steam power from the crude, inefficient designs of the previous century to the refined, powerful machines that now drive Britain's industrial economy. Hornsby's steam-driven threshing machine is demonstrated in the open field outside the Crystal Palace, where it can operate without filling the glass structure with smoke and noise. The machine separates grain from chaff with mechanical efficiency, doing in hours what would once have taken days of manual labor. For agricultural reformers and landowners, it represents progress. For the farm workers it displaces, it represents yet another machine taking their livelihoods. In another section, visitors encounter Frederick Bakewell's facsimile machine, also known as an image telegraph. This device can transmit images over telegraph wires, a technology so novel, so seemingly magical, that many observers struggle to understand how it works. The telegraph itself, which can send messages across vast distances in minutes, is already transforming communication, commerce, and warfare. The idea that images, not just words, might be transmitted is both thrilling and slightly unsettling, a glimpse into a future where distance matters less and less. Photography, too, is on display, though it is still in its relative infancy. The daguerreotype and calotype processes have been known for about a decade, and photographers are experimenting with ways to improve image quality, reduce exposure times, and make the medium more accessible. At the exhibition, visitors can see photographic portraits, landscapes, and architectural studies, frozen moments of light and shadow that capture reality with a fidelity no painting can match. Some find the images beautiful, others find them eerie, this mechanical reproduction of the human face, stripped of the artist's interpretive hand. There are textile machines, of coarse power looms and spinning frames, the very machines that displaced the Luddites and now employ the children we met in the first segment. These machines are presented as triumphs of efficiency and innovation, their ability to produce vast quantities of fabric at low cost celebrated without mention of the human toll. A power loom on display can weave intricate patterns with speed and precision, guided by jacquard cards that dictate the placement of each thread. It is a marvel of mechanical ingenuity and a tool of economic transformation that has left countless hand weavers destitute. There are printing machines, two machines that can produce newspapers, books, and images far faster than any hand press. Applegath's patented printing machine and Cooper's press are among the most advanced, capable of churning out thousands of impressions per hour. The democratization of information, the spread of literacy, the rise of the popular press, all of it depends on machines like these. Yet here, too, the human cost is elided. The printers and compositors whose craft is being mechanized are absent from the narrative on display. Britain occupies half the exhibition space, a reflection of its status as the world's leading industrial power. The other half is divided among nations and colonies, India, Australia, Canada, and others, each displaying the raw materials and manufactured goods that flow through the networks of empire. There is Indian cotton and Australian wool, Canadian timber and African ivory. The exhibition presents these as gifts of empire, evidence of Britain's civilizing mission, but they are also, of course, the spoils of conquest and exploitation, extracted from colonized lands and peoples whose labor enriches the metropole. The contradictions are everywhere, if one chooses to see them. The Crystal Palace itself, this triumph of modern engineering and design, was built using glass and iron forged in factories, where children labor in conditions of unimaginable hardship. The hydraulic press that can lift 1,144 tons is operated by a single man. Yet the mills that produce Britain's textiles employ thousands of children whose bodies are broken by the work. The steam engines on display, so elegant and powerful, drive machinery that has displaced skilled workers and driven down wages across entire industries. And yet, for most visitors, these contradictions are invisible or at least easy to overlook. The exhibition is a celebration, a spectacle, a source of national pride. It tells a story of progress, of human mastery over nature, of Britain's place at the forefront of civilization. The suffering that underpins this progress, the child laborers, the displaced artisans, the colonized peoples, is not part of the story being told here. Some inventions on display will genuinely transform daily life, will make existence easier and more comfortable for millions of people. The telegraph will shrink distances, making communication faster and more reliable. Advances in hydraulic engineering will improve bridges and buildings, making infrastructure safer and more durable. Improvements in steam engine efficiency will reduce fuel costs and make transportation more accessible. These are real achievements, and they deserve recognition. But other inventions serve primarily to enrich factory owners and industrialists, to concentrate wealth and power in fewer hands. The power looms and spinning frames that produce cheap textiles do so by exploiting child labor and driving skilled workers into poverty. The agricultural machines that increase efficiency also displace farm workers, swelling the ranks of the urban poor, who have no choice but to seek employment in the factories. The printing machines that spread information also spread propaganda, shaping public opinion in ways that serve the interests of the powerful. The Great Exhibition runs from May to October 1851. By the time it closes, 6 million people have visited, and the event has generated a substantial profit enough to fund the establishment of what will become the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, and the Natural History Museum in South Kensington. The Crystal Palace itself is disassembled and rebuilt in Sydenham, where it will stand for another 85 years before being destroyed by fire in 1936. But in 1851, standing beneath the glass roof, surrounded by the accumulated achievements of the industrial age, visitors are invited to feel awe, pride, and optimism. They are invited to believe that progress is inevitable, that the future will be better than the past, that the suffering of the present moment is a temporary inconvenience on the road to universal prosperity. For the children working in the textile mills, those 7-year-olds crawling beneath the looms, breathing the cotton dust, beaten for falling asleep, the Great Exhibition might as well be on the moon. They will never walk through the Crystal Palace, never marvel at the hydraulic press or the steam hammer, never see the photographs or the telegraphs or the exotic goods from distant lands. Their world is bounded by the factory walls, by the relentless rhythm of the machines, by the struggle to survive each day. And yet, in a sense, the exhibition is built on their backs. The glass and iron, the textiles and machines, the wealth that makes such a spectacle possible, all of it depends on their labor, their suffering, their stunted lives. They are the hidden foundation of Victorian progress, the unacknowledged cost of Britain's industrial dominance. By 1851, some reforms have been enacted. The Factory Act of 1833 limited working hours for children and mandated minimal education, 2 hours a day. Factory inspectors have been appointed to enforce the law, though they are too few and the factories too many, and enforcement remains inconsistent. A report from 1835 claimed that child labor in textile factories had decreased by 50%, though this figure is difficult to verify and may reflect as much wishful thinking as reality. The 1851 census shows that 98% of children under the age of 10 do not work regularly for wages. A statistic that sounds encouraging until one realizes that it means 2% still do, and that children aged 10 to 14 are another matter entirely. Of that age group, 28% are working rather than attending school, and many of those who are counted as attending school are also working part-time. The reforms are real, but they are incomplete, and the exploitation of child labor remains a central feature of Britain's industrial economy. So the Great Exhibition stands as both a celebration and a lie. It celebrates real achievements, the ingenuity of engineers, the creativity of inventors, the power of human beings to reshape the world. But it also obscures the costs of those achievements, the lives broken and discarded in the pursuit of progress, the profound inequalities that industrialization has created and entrenched. Visitors leave the Crystal Palace inspired, uplifted, filled with pride in Britain's accomplishments. They return to their homes, some comfortable, some modest, some desperately poor, and life continues. The machines keep turning. The children keep working, and the story of progress marches on, bright and gleaming as the glass palace itself, leaving its shadows behind. Now let us leave behind the Crystal Palace, that glittering monument to progress, and travel north. Travel to Yorkshire, perhaps, or Lancashire to the heart of the textile districts, where the great mills stand like fortresses of brick and iron, their chimneys belching smoke into the gray sky. But we are not going to the mills themselves. We have already spent time on those floors, crawling beneath the looms with the children, breathing the cotton dust. Instead, we are going to visit the home of the man who owns those mills. We are going to step inside a world that exists at the opposite end of the economic spectrum, from the cramped, damp tenements where his workers live. Imagine then a carriage pulling up a long tree-lined drive. The drive curves gracefully through landscaped grounds, acres of carefully tended gardens, ornamental shrubs, and expansive lawns that seem to roll on forever. In the distance, beyond a small artificial lake, you can see the walls of the estate-high stone barriers that mark the boundary between this private world and the squalor of the industrial towns below. The air here is cleaner, fresher. The smoke from the mills does not reach this far, or if it does, it is diluted by distance and dispersed by the wind. The house itself is a mansion and ornate Victorian residence built in the 1850s or 1860s, when the textile trade was at its most profitable and fortunes were being made with breathtaking speed. It is designed in the Gothic Revival style, perhaps, or the Italianate style that became fashionable after Prince Albert championed it. The facade is imposing tall windows with elaborate stonework, turrets and gables, a grand entrance with columns and a portico. This is not a house. It is a statement. It announces to anyone who sees it that the man who lives here has wealth, status, and power. Step inside. The entrance hall is vast, with a floor of polished marble or intricate tiles imported from Italy. The walls are paneled in dark wood oak or mahogany and hung with paintings in gilded frames. Above, a chandelier of cut crystal catches the light from the tall windows, scattering it in 1,000 tiny rainbows. A grand staircase sweeps upward to the second floor, its banister carved with elaborate scrollwork. The mansion has more than 20 rooms, though only 5 or 6 people live here. The mill owner himself, his wife, their 2 or 3 children, and perhaps 1 or 2 live-in servants. The rest of the staff, the maids, the cook, the laundress, the gardeners, the coachman live in separate quarters on the estate or in nearby cottages. The sheer amount of space, the ratio of rooms to inhabitants, is itself a form of conspicuous consumption, a display of wealth through abundance and excess. Let us walk through the house. The drawing room is furnished with pieces purchased from London's finest cabinet makers, or perhaps even from the Great Exhibition itself. There are chairs upholstered in silk damask, a sofa with intricately carved legs, side tables inlaid with ivory and mother of pearl. The walls are papered with the latest fashionable designs, perhaps a William Morris pattern, all stylized flowers and vines, printed on paper that cost more per roll than a mill worker earns in a month. On the mantelpiece above the marble fireplace are ornaments porcelain figurines, a French clock under a glass dome, candlesticks of polished brass. The room is cluttered in the Victorian fashion, every surface covered with objects that serve no functional purpose but exist solely to demonstrate taste and affluence. There is a piano in the corner, its rosewood case polished to a high shine. The mill owner's wife plays occasionally, and she has hired a music teacher to instruct the children. The dining room is even more lavish. A long table of dark wood dominates the space, surrounded by high-backed chairs with seats covered in velvet. The table can seat 20 guests comfortably, though it is rare for the family to entertain on such a scale, except during the most important social occasions. Above the table hangs another chandelier, this one even larger than the one in the entrance hall. The walls are lined with sideboards and display cabinets, their shelves filled with china and silverware plates and serving dishes and wine goblets, many of them imported from France or Germany, all of them expensive. When the mill owner hosts a dinner party, the table is set with linen napkins and tablecloths of the finest Irish linen, woven on looms perhaps, looms not unlike those in his own mills, though the workers who produced this cloth were paid a bit better than the children who tend his machines. The meal itself is elaborate multiple courses, each more extravagant than the last. There is soup, fish, roast meat, game birds, vegetables, puddings, and cheeses. Wine flows freely, poured from crystal decanters into gleaming glasses. The guests are other mill owners, merchants, lawyers, perhaps a local magistrate or member of parliament. They are the nouveau rich men who have made their fortunes in trade and industry rather than inheriting land and titles from their fathers. Some of the old aristocracy look down on them, viewing them as vulgar and ostentatious, lacking the refinement and breeding that comes from centuries of privilege. But the industrialists have money, and money buys influence, and increasingly, the old aristocracy finds itself marrying its daughters to the sons of mill owners in order to replenish depleted estates. The conversations at these dinner parties are carefully calibrated. The men discuss business, the state of the textile trade, the price of raw cotton, the latest innovations in machinery. They talk about politics, about the debates in Parliament, about the need to keep wages low and resist the demands of labor unions. They speak with confidence and certainty, secure in their belief that they are the architects of Britain's greatness, that their success is evidence of their virtue and intelligence. And yet, beneath the confidence, there is sometimes a hint of defensiveness. They are aware, even if they do not admit it openly, that their wealth is built on the labor of others, on the children crawling beneath the looms, on the displaced hand weavers now destitute and desperate, on the workers living in tenements so overcrowded that 15 people share a single windowless room. They are aware that there are reformers, journalists, and politicians who criticize the conditions in the mills, who call for stricter regulations and shorter working hours. The mill owner has his rationalizations ready. He provides employment, does he not? Without his mills, these people would have nothing, no wages, no livelihood, no hope of survival. Yes, the work is hard, but life has always been hard for the laboring classes. Is it not better to work in a mill than to starve in the countryside? And besides, he treats his workers fairly, or so he tells himself. He does not use the truck system, paying his workers in goods rather than cash. He does not employ children under the age of 8 well, not officially, anyway. He has even built a church for his workers, funding its construction out of his own pocket. This is philanthropy of a sort. Many industrial magnates engage in it, building churches, funding schools, endowing libraries, creating public parks. It is partly genuine altruism, a desire to give back to the community and improve the lives of the less fortunate. But it is also self-interest. enlightened self-interest, as historians have called it. By providing churches and schools and parks, the mill owners hope to create a more orderly, docile, and productive workforce. They hope to stave off social unrest, to prevent the kind of violence and upheaval that marked the Luddite years. And they hope to earn the respect and admiration of their peers, to be seen not as exploiters, but as benefactors. The mill owner we are visiting has indeed built a church, a handsome stone structure with a tall spire, designed by a fashionable architect and funded entirely by him. He attends services there every Sunday with his family, sitting in a private pew at the front, separate from the workers who fill the benches behind. The minister, whose salary is also paid by the mill owner, preaches sermons about duty, obedience, and the importance of accepting one's station in life. The workers listen, some devout, some merely going through the motions, and afterward they return to their cramped homes and their exhausting labor. Let us return to the mansion. Upstairs, the bedrooms are spacious and well appointed. The master bedroom has a 4-poster bed draped with curtains of heavy fabric, a wardrobe filled with fine clothing, a dressing table with a mirror and silver-backed brushes. The children's rooms are smaller, but still comfortable, each child having a space that would seem palatial to the children working in the mills. There is a nursery, a schoolroom where a governess teaches the children to read and write and do arithmetic skills that the mill children will never have the opportunity to learn. The library is one of the mill owner's favorite rooms. It is lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves, their shelves filled with leather-bound volumes, histories, novels, works of philosophy and science. He fancies himself an educated man, a patron of culture and learning. He has purchased subscriptions to learned journals and memberships in literary societies. He may even fancy himself a reformer, supporting certain moderate improvements in working conditions, provided, of course, that those improvements do not significantly cut into his profits. His wife, too, has her pursuits. She manages the household, overseeing the servants and planning the social calendar. She engages in charitable work visiting the sick, distributing alms to the deserving poor, organizing fundraising events for worthy causes. She is, by the standards of her class, a virtuous and dutiful woman. But she has never set foot inside her husband's mills. She has never seen the children crawling beneath the looms, never smelled the cotton dust, never heard the deafening clatter of the machinery. That world is as distant from her as the palaces of the Orient. She knows it exists, in an abstract sense, but it has no tangible reality for her. The grounds of the estate are a source of pride. There are formal gardens with geometric flower beds, gravel paths lined with sculpted hedges, a greenhouse where exotic plants are cultivated orchids, ferns, perhaps even a few tropical species brought back from the colonies. In summer, the family hosts lawn parties, inviting guests to stroll through the gardens, play croquet on the lawn, and enjoy refreshments served on the terrace. In winter, they retreat indoors, where fires burn in every room, and the cold is kept at bay by thick walls and heavy curtains. The mill owner also maintains a carriage house with several vehicles, a formal carriage for social occasions, a smaller, lighter vehicle for everyday use, perhaps even a newer model purchased just for its novelty. He employs a coachman to drive them and a groom to tend the horses. When he travels to the mill, he does so in comfort, insulated from the dirt and noise of the industrial districts, arriving at his office without ever having to set foot on the factory floor unless he chooses to. He does not think of himself as cruel. He does not relish the suffering of his workers. He simply sees it as necessary, an unavoidable consequence of the economic system that has made him wealthy. If he were to raise wages or reduce hours, his competitors would undercut him, and he would lose business. If he were to refuse to employ children, other mill owners would, and he would be at a disadvantage. He is, he tells himself, merely playing by the rules of the game and playing it successfully. The distance between his life and the lives of his workers is almost incomprehensible. While his children sleep in comfortable beds in spacious rooms, the children in his mills sleep on straw mattresses in rooms shared with a dozen others. While his family dines on roast meat and fine wine, the mill workers eat bread and gruel, if they eat at all. While he enjoys leisure music, reading, garden parties, the workers labor 12 or 14 or 16 hours a day, their bodies breaking under the strain. And yet, this distance is not unusual. It is the norm in Victorian Britain, a society structured around profound inequalities of wealth and power. The mill owner is not an aberration. He is the product of a system that rewards those who can extract the maximum amount of labor for the minimum amount of pay, a system that values profit above all else. Some mill owners are worse than others. Some are genuinely brutal, paying poverty wages, enforcing discipline with savage beatings, caring nothing for the welfare of their workers. Others, like the one whose mansion we are visiting, are more paternalistic. They build churches and schools, create libraries and parks, provide some small comforts to their workers, while still extracting enormous profits from their labor. The Scottish-American industrialist Andrew Carnegie, who made his fortune in steel, articulated what he called the gospel of wealth, the idea that the rich have a moral obligation to use their fortunes for the public good. He built libraries across Britain and America, funded educational institutions, and gave away hundreds of millions of dollars before his death in 1919. But even Carnegie's philanthropy was rooted in the assumption that vast inequalities of wealth were natural and necessary, that the rich were simply better equipped to decide how resources should be used. As the evening draws on in the mill owner's mansion, the family gathers in the drawing room. The children play with toys, wooden soldiers, dolls with porcelain faces, perhaps a rocking horse in the corner. The wife plays a piece on the piano, something by Chopin or Schumann, her fingers moving gracefully over the keys. The mill owner reads the newspaper, scanning the financial pages, checking the price of cotton and the state of the markets. Outside, beyond the walls of the estate, the mills continue to operate. The night shift has begun. The children drag themselves to the factory floor, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, their bodies aching. The looms clatter, the dust fills the air. And the machines, those tireless engines of industrial capitalism, turn and turn and turn. The mill owner does not think about this. Or if he does, it is only in passing, a fleeting acknowledgement of the mechanism that generates his wealth. His mind is on other things, on the dinner party he will host next week, on the shares he is considering purchasing, on the new wing he is thinking of adding to the mansion. He sleeps well at night in his four-poster bed with its soft mattress and heavy quilts. His conscience, if it troubles him at all, is easily soothed by the knowledge that he is a respectable man, a pillar of the community, a benefactor who has built churches and funded schools. He has done his duty, he believes. He has provided employment. He has contributed to progress. And if some must suffer so that Britain can thrive, so that the nation can stand at the forefront of industrial civilization, well, that is simply the way of the world. And so the night passes. In the mansion, all is quiet, warm, and comfortable. In the mills, the machines clatter on, and the children work, and the vast machinery of industrial capitalism continues its relentless operation, grinding some into dust while lifting others to heights of wealth and comfort almost unimaginable to those at the bottom. We have traveled a long way tonight. We began in the mills, crawling beneath the looms with 7-year-old children, breathing the cotton dust, feeling the exhaustion that never quite lifts. We stood with the Luddites as they smashed the machines that threatened their livelihoods, and we watched as they were hunted down, tried, and hanged for defending a world that was already disappearing. We walked through the Crystal Palace, marveling at the achievements of the industrial age, while noting the human cost that made those achievements possible. And finally, we stepped inside the mansion of a mill owner, surrounded by luxury and comfort, purchased with the labor of those who will never know such ease. These are the contradictions of Victorian Britain: progress and exploitation, innovation and suffering, wealth and poverty existing side by side, interdependent yet worlds apart. The machines that were supposed to bring prosperity created new forms of misery. The factories that made Britain the workshop of the world consumed the bodies and spirits of those who worked in them. And the men who profited most from this transformation lived in a state of willful blindness, congratulating themselves on their virtue while ignoring the suffering that underpinned their success. By the late 19th century, reforms had begun to improve conditions slowly, grudgingly, in the face of fierce resistance from those who feared that any concession to workers' welfare would undermine profitability. Working hours were limited. Child labor was restricted, though not eliminated. Factory inspectors enforced some basic standards of safety and sanitation. The worst excesses of early industrialization were gradually curtailed, not out of the goodness of mill owners' hearts, but because workers organized, reformers agitated, and governments reluctantly intervened. But in the 1830s and 1840s, in the years we have been visiting tonight, those reforms were still decades away. The children were still crawling beneath the looms. The Luddites were still being hanged. The Crystal Palace was still just a dream. And the mill owners were still building their mansions, secure in the belief that their wealth was earned, their success deserved, their consciences clear. History does not offer simple morals or easy lessons. It offers instead the opportunity to see how our world was made, to understand the forces that shaped it, the choices that were made, the costs that were paid. The Industrial Revolution transformed human civilization, lifting millions out of poverty, extending lifespans, creating possibilities that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations. But it also created new forms of suffering, new injustices, new inequalities. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you can take comfort in the knowledge that the world has changed. The children no longer crawl beneath the looms. The machines are no longer smashed in desperate nighttime raids. The Crystal Palace is gone, consumed by fire in 1936, though the museums it helped to fund remain. And the mansions of the mill owners have been repurposed, turned into hotels, hospitals, wedding venues, apartments, their original purpose fading into memory. But the questions raised by this history remain. Who benefits from progress? What are we willing to sacrifice in its name? How do we balance the drive for innovation and profit with the need for justice and human dignity? These questions have no simple answers. They never have. And perhaps they never will. Rest now. Let the past recede. Let the clatter of the looms fade into silence. Let the images, the children's faces, the Luddites' hammers, the glittering glass palace, the opulent mansion, dissolve into the gentle drift of sleep. The history we have explored tonight is over. It belongs to another time, another world. And you, in your present moment, are safe, warm, and far removed from those struggles. Sleep well.